Speaking from experience, there's a lot of daunting things about London when you first move to the city. One of these things is just the sheer size of the place, meaning working out how to get from place to place when you first move here can be quite confusing and a bit stressful. One of the great things about London is that there's so many different transport methods for how to get about. However, when you do first move here, it's hard to tell which is the best to use in different situations. All these methods have their own pros and cons, whether that's the price, their accessibility, how much fun it is to take them, or just what times they're available during the day. So in this video, I'm going to go through the main transport methods in London, let you know what I think about each and every one, and how I advise using them. Before we get into the different methods, I just want to say, Happy New Year. This is the first video that I'm uploading in 2022, so I hope everyone has a great year, and thank you for choosing some of the time in your new year to watch my video. So the first transport method that we're going to be talking about today is potentially the most obvious one, and that is the tube/train. So the underground system is world renowned for being the main way to get around London. Despite its shortcomings such as delays, tube strikes, and lack of coverage in some areas of London, it is honestly one of the best ways to get around the city. For a relatively low price, you can quickly travel from one side of the city to the other, or by switching from line to line, you can basically get anywhere in the city without taking a step outside. As well as the underground, there are other rail services in London. These include the National Rail train service, the Docklands Light Railway, and also the tram service in Croydon. I personally use the National Rail system a lot, as living in southeast London, there's a very quick train that takes me straight into central London in about 15 minutes, which means despite not living in central London, it makes that part of the city very accessible to me. Unfortunately, at the time of recording, something that was really great about the underground, which isn't currently happening as much, is the night tube. Previous to the pandemic, there were a number of lines that operated throughout the night at the weekend. This meant that if you're out late for whatever reason, you could easily get back home for an affordable price at any time. Overall, the train and tube in London is one of the best ways to get around the city, and if you move to London, then I'm sure you'll be using it all the time. The next method I'm going to be talking about is one of my personal favourites, and that is cycling. So London doesn't have a reputation for being one of the best places to cycle. The roads are very busy. It's also a fairly hilly city, meaning compared to some cities, say on the continent, like Amsterdam or cities in Germany, which are a lot flatter, then cycling is not as easy. Despite that though, there is an expanding network of cycling paths, especially in central London, and also from outer parts of London taking you into the city. These are brilliant to cycle on, as it means you don't have to compete with traffic on the road. And personally for me, I still don't mind cycling on the road with traffic. I actually find it a bit exciting, although it isn't the safest thing to do. Owning a bike in the city can be a bit of a risk. If you've seen one of my previous videos, then you will have seen that bike theft is quite a common issue in the city. Last year, I had a bike stolen from my apartment block, which was a pretty sad experience. What I've done since then is actually purchase a bike that was much cheaper than the one I had stolen, meaning that if that bike does ever get stolen, it's not as much of a loss as my previous one. If you don't fancy owning a bike, there's also lots of bike rental services. The one I'd probably recommend the most is the Santander cycle scheme, also known as Boris bikes. With these, for a relatively low amount, you can pick them up from the docking station, cycle where you want to go, and park them at the closest docking station to your destination. They aren't the best bikes, they've only got about 3 gears and they are very heavy. Also, you don't get a helmet with them, so either you have to risk it or bring your own helmet, so it isn't always the safest method of transport, but they are very fun and convenient. The next method of transport that I'll be talking about is actually one that leads quite nicely on from Boris bikes, as it's another method of transport that you rent, and that is electric scooters. So this is a fairly new thing in London. For quite a while, companies didn't actually get the license in London to rent out scooters. That changed last year, meaning now electric scooters have popped up all over the city. They're very cheap, they're very fun, and they're very easy to use. There's a variety of companies that offer these scooter rentals. The one that I've used the most is Lime. The experience I had on those scooters was extremely positive. It was very easy to set up on the app, get my scooter and then scoot off into the distance. The speed on the scooters are quite impressive, making them very fun. Again, similar to Boris bikes, you don't get like a helmet or anything, so either you have to risk it or be fairly unsafe. Additionally, similar to cycling, you are required to use them on the road, which means you are competing with traffic, again, not making them super safe. Despite that though, they are very convenient and very fast at getting you to nearby locations. Taking a step back now to a bit of a more traditional method of transport, and that is simply walking around the city. Just by walking, you see so much more of London. This is great if you've first moved to the city, or even if you've been here a number of years like I have. You're always spotting new things if you just take a walk instead of going underground, or another method of transport where you're a bit more dormant and maybe looking at your phone. Especially in central London, you'll be quite shocked how close things actually are to each other. Quite often, if you compare using an app such as Citymapper or Google Maps or Apple Maps, you'll realise that walking is a lot quicker than getting the tube. Obviously, there's lots of other benefits to doing this as well that I probably don't need to tell you, such as it being free and a much healthier method of transport than just sitting on your arse on a train. I'd personally try and walk or cycle as much as I can and avoid other methods of transport. I know a lot of the time that isn't possible, but when it is, that's what I do. Next up is probably the most expensive method of transport for getting around London, and that is taxis, Ubers, and other ride-hailing apps. As with other major cities, in London you do have the luxury of having lots of taxis and Ubers available to you. This means that you can take private transport to your destination, being driven by a driver in one of these vehicles. As mentioned before though, this does mean it is the most expensive method of transport. Especially in the last few months, I've noticed that apps such as Uber have dramatically increased their prices, especially late at night. If you've been on a night out and you're trying to get an Uber back home, so many people are doing this at the same time, mainly because of what I mentioned before about the night tube not running. Uber adds surcharges to their apps, making these trips very expensive. There are other apps though. My personal favourite one is called Bolt. I know from speaking to the drivers in cabs as well, they do prefer Bolt to Uber. Apparently the drivers do get more money from Bolt, and also as a customer it is often a lot cheaper than using an Uber. Black cabs are also a nice way of getting around, especially in central London. It's something that I don't do very often just because of the convenience of getting an Uber or a Bolt from my phone. However, when I've used them in the past, they've always been a positive but expensive experience. Next up is a transport method that might seem a bit strange if you don't already live in the city, and that is taking the boat somewhere. So in London, obviously we've got the Thames going through the middle of the city. On the river there's a service called the Thames Clipper, which has had its naming rights bought by Uber to now be called Uber Boat. And this is basically what it sounds like. It's a public boat that takes you from one destination to another. It's not private, so you're not selecting specific parts of the city to stop at. It has a set route more similar to a train. However, it does have a lot of stops along its route, especially ones that would interest tourists or people trying to explore the city. When you're travelling on the boat, you pass many of the most famous landmarks in London, such as Westminster, the London Eye, Canary Wharf, and more. This means it's one of the more enjoyable transport methods to use in London. However, its convenience and price isn't quite as good as something as the tube. I say that about the convenience just because it only really has two routes, one going east and one going west. If you want to travel north and south in the city, obviously you're not going to get the Thames Clipper. Additionally, with price, just going a few stops on it can add up. It's nowhere near as expensive as something like a taxi or an Uber. However, it is usually more expensive than getting the underground. I know we've gone through a lot of transport methods already, but there is two more. The next one is something that I probably wouldn't really recommend in the city, and that is driving. A lot of people do own cars in London. That's why the roads are so full. However, compared to other parts of the UK, car ownership is definitely way lower here per person. This is just because of how densely packed the city is. the congestion charges and emission charges that you have to pay, and also the general lack of space and cost of parking. There are a lot of services for car rentals, which I'd probably recommend a lot more than actually owning a car. One of these services is called Zipcar, which is extremely convenient. You just use an app to find the closest car to you. You can go up to it, unlock it with the app, drive however long you need to, stop the car in a certain area, and then end your route, and you get charged through the app for your journey. This is ideal in a lot of situations. I know in my friend group, the most common one is probably going to somewhere like IKEA, where you need to pick up furniture and take it home. And the final transport method, which is a famous one, but also I think quite an underrated one in London, and that is taking the bus. So I think there's a bit of a stigma in London about taking the bus. Maybe that's just because of the famous In-Betweeners clip from back in the day, but getting the bus in London quite often is the most convenient and almost always, other than walking and cycling, the cheapest. When you take the bus in London, you pay a flat fee of £1.80. Within an hour, you can change buses as many times as you'd like, and it doesn't actually matter how far away your end destination is from where you started. You're still paying the same amount. On top of that, there's buses running 24/7, meaning that if you can't afford to get an Uber back home at the end of a night out, quite often the bus is your best option, as you're still only paying £1.80. In terms of convenience or time, it isn't one of the best methods. It definitely takes longer than something like the tube, train, or definitely compared to a taxi or Uber. However, quite often for me, I think just that low price makes it a great option. And when I wake up in the morning after a night out and I've taken the bus instead of spending £30 to £50 on an Uber, I'm usually pretty proud of myself. So that's all the transport methods that I'm going to be talking about today. Let me know any that you thought I missed. Obviously, you could take a helicopter somewhere, you could skate, you could walk on your hands. Let me know any of those. I'm interested to know what I missed. But I do hope, especially for people who are about to move to the city, this video was useful. If that's the case, then please do give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more London-based content. Follow me on social media at jackjenkinsyt. And apart from that, see you in the next one.